Thank you all for being here at NRDC's session on driving energy efficiency. We're looking forward to hearing from all of you today. NRDC, or the Natural Resources Defense Council, is one of the nation's leading environmental advocacy organizations. We have 1.3 million members and activists, and we've been working for over 40 years on a range of environmental issues in the US and also internationally in China, India, Latin America, and Canada. In India, we've been working for the last 4 years with partners, local partners on the ground on clean energy and climate change projects. One of the key areas of focus of our work in India is energy efficiency. And we work with governments and businesses on accelerating the adoption of energy efficiency across stakeholders on the ground in India and in India's rapidly growing cities and states. So there's more information on our projects both in India and internationally in the materials that were handed out to you. But before I do, I will turn it over to Peter Leonard, who is NRDC's Executive Director for Welcome Remarks. Peter is responsible for guiding NRDC's policy positions, advocacy strategies, communication plans, development, and administration, and manages our 7 offices. Previously, he served as chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau for the state of New York's Attorney General's office. And before that, he created and led the Environmental Prosecution Unit for New York City. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Radhika. And before I start, let me just say it's great to be here with the whole NRDC team. I'm going to make a little plug for them. Jacob Scher there started our international work probably 35 years ago and has been a luminary and a visionary in NRDC's foray into working internationally. Susan Casey Lefkowitz here runs NRDC's international program. Anjali Jaiswal, who runs our India work, isn't here today, but many of you may have met, and she's does about as much as all the rest of us put together. And I should say John Bryson, sitting next to me, who you'll hear from in a minute, is actually one of NRDC's founders 43 years ago. So we are very grateful to John for founding us and staying in close touch for these many years. Energy efficiency is also obviously a critical issue. As we like to say, it's the cleanest, cheapest, fastest. You always have to say that quickly. Way to provide energy as well as to reduce environmental harms. We were talking this morning with Mr. Valuri of Ingersoll Rand, and I was reminded of a personal story about the really miracle of energy efficiency. Separate from NRDC, I oversee a sugar mill in Costa Rica, another developing country. And at a certain point, we had enough energy after you cut the cane, you crush the fiber, and that powers the mill. And that cane powered the mill and no more. But we made the mill more efficient, and the same amount of cane was able to power a distillery and a turbine that allows us to convert the molasses into ethanol and sell 14 megawatts. So all the energy for the turbine and the distillery is essentially energy that came from energy efficiency. Energy efficiency as a source of energy that allows you to grow. And that is an important angle. It is not only a way to save money, and it's not only a way to reduce pollution load, but it's also a way to allow new economic growth without having to build new power plants or new other transmission lines. So thank you for that suggestion this morning, because that's, Mr. Valuri was saying, an important angle in India, where the issue of economic growth and bringing energy to millions who don't have energy is a critical issue. And tapping into this huge potential of energy efficiency has been one of NRDC's major efforts for the past 30 years. We are probably the largest group with the largest team working on energy efficiency in the United States. And we see that this is a tremendous opportunity, not only in the United States, but also in our international work in China, India, and Latin America. Just to give some scale, the McKinsey & Company, a global consulting firm, concluded that the US alone is sitting on about $1.2 trillion in energy savings. And these are energy savings. The challenge, of course, is that these energy savings are all over. It's not one big place. That's also the benefit of them, because we can find energy savings in our appliances, our homes, our businesses, and our communities. In New York City, we helped design a program to benchmark buildings, privately owned buildings in New York, called the Greater Greener Buildings Plan. Most things in English have these alliterative titles that we try to be catchy. And simply measuring energy was a breakthrough. A lot of these buildings, even built by sophisticated builders and run by sophisticated tenants, really weren't paying attention to their energy use. And the first step, which you would think is so simple, turned out to be a critical first step, measuring the energy use, and therefore what you measure, you monitor, and what you monitor, you can make a difference in. We estimate that efforts to follow through with this and take advantage of the energy efficiency just in New York City will put about 17,000 people to work and will save more than $700 million every year in energy costs. We see the same opportunity in India, where 70% of the buildings that will exist in 2030 aren't yet built. And air conditioner use in Indian homes and businesses is expected to rise exponentially from 3 million units in 2009 to approximately 300 units, 100 times more, in 2030. Incorporating the most energy efficient windows, lighting, and air conditioning systems right now at the design stage in India is far more economical than costly retrofits down the road, as we are having to do here in the United States. And many Indian states are already taking significant steps to accelerate this energy efficiency, and we're fortunate to be working on the ground with partners in India to advance these energy efficiency solutions. We work with the state governments in India, for example, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, to share best practices in the international building code compliance models. And similar to our work in other countries, we also worked with business leaders, like many of you, and Mr. Valori and others, to make the business case for energy efficiency. Last month, NRDC's president, Francis Beinecke, released our landmark analysis on the business case for energy efficiency buildings in India, which Radhika is holding up here, and is that available out front? And is available out front, and I urge you to take a look at that. And the key is that by demonstrating to businesses globally that this is a win-win, they can earn a profit and protect the environment at the same time, and I should say also make a better working conditions for the employees, and therefore often get better employees. We can share, and sharing international best practices, we can accelerate this in all areas. So again, we want to focus on energy efficiency. I said yesterday at the CEO Roundtable that it's critical to link energy efficiency with renewable energy. Renewable energy is often a lot more sexy, but energy efficiency is what can provide the funding for renewable energy investments. I would also say that you also have to link it with the true cost of dirty energy, because right now both efficiency and clean energy often have to fight heavily subsidized dirty energy. So that's a major challenge for us in the United States. It's less of what we do in India. But we look forward very much to the discussion today. We thank you all for coming, and I'm in particular looking forward to hearing John speak.
Now, Peter, thank you very much. And
I think Radhika's going to
I'm
yeah,
sorry. Oh,
that's
yeah.
okay.
read your resume.
Well, we're delighted to have you here. And John is currently a distinguished senior public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center, and he focuses on ways to mitigate the potentially devastating impacts of climate change over the next decade, and is prioritized on 3 countries, China, US, and India. So very relevant. And as Peter said before, in 1970, John helped found NRDC, and he later joined Edison International, where he was chairman and CEO for nearly 18 years. He also served as US Secretary of Commerce until June 2012 during President Obama's first term. So thank you, John, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. I'm honored to be here, and the reference to NRDC, of course, means a lot to me. But what's happened over all these years, Gus and I and 2 or 3 other people that were the initial founders of NRDC, that was 1969. And we were 26 years old, and we had absolutely no idea that there would be any potential, and we lofted this foundation, maybe you know this story, into the Ford Foundation. And that was against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. And to our amazement, the Ford Foundation, led by its then chairman, said, okay. Now, that was the beginning. There were a lot of complications from that point forward. We had to step back for a year because the Ford Foundation was in the news, and we got in the news, and everybody didn't like us, and there was no such thing as environment. There were, people didn't refer to any degree to environment at that time. That's why we were called the Natural Resources Defense Council. And what's happened over these 40-plus years is nothing short of extraordinary. And it has to do, of course, with leadership. And there have been such extraordinary leaders, and then leaders who took interests and passions within the broad realm of environment and have made a difference. So, Susan, what you're doing now as a leader internationally, and particularly in India and other places around the world, was just unimaginable. We just couldn't possibly have foreseen that. And one of the funny things was we wanted to start, and the Ford Foundation insisted that we get paid at the level of $25,000 a year. And we were outraged. We thought that was awful. We didn't intend to do that at all. We really were there to serve. But they insisted that, someday we might get married and have families and things like that. And so we ought to move along.
Pay him much more now.
Yeah, vastly more, not much more, just a smidgen. Well, it was, what happened, just to take that story a little further, so the Ford Foundation got all this flack, so McGeorge Bundy, who had been a leader in the administration, obviously, of John F. Kennedy, and then was not highly thought of by students because of the development of the Vietnam War. And maybe you know this story, but so he, McBundy, said, all right, we've got to bring together our board of directors, and we need to take the senior most ones who are lawyers. And so they met with us, and there were 3 or 4 of us, Gus and I, and I forgot who else. And we went back down to the Ford Foundation, and we figured, oh, this is over. And they went around the room, and finally the most senior of them said, well, sometimes you can do worse than betting on young people. And so that's where we went. That's how it came forward. And then I had the great advantage and good fortune. I was from Oregon and the West Coast, and to be part of opening the New York office, and then with Gus, the Washington, D.C. office, and then the California office got another grant, and things continued on from there. So I'll get into NRDC and energy efficiency, and then I want to close with what I'm doing now with this focus on climate change and my wonderful team who are here with me, and we are working around the clock, and India, as you say, has been an enormous priority for us, and frankly, we can't imagine addressing climate change without a principal focus on India for reasons that I think all of you know, and that were so beautifully, beautifully expressed in the dinner and panel last night. Dr. Pachauri set it out, this billion people in India that deserve and need to have the opportunity to have their country in a position where they can bring forth climate, they can capture sunlight. Can you hear all right? Is it? Yeah. So I trust that many of you were there last night. I think it was just absolutely compelling. And then I had the great good fortune afterwards of having dinner at the Cosmos Club with Dr. Pachauri, and he really is an extraordinary person. Al Gore expressed it powerfully. Each of the members of the panel from India extraordinarily well. The U.S. ambassador from India is certainly one of the most extraordinary speakers in her concise, powerful way, and I had the great privilege of coming to know her when I was the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and she, as I think we all know, she is not only now the Indian ambassador to the United States, which of course we're honored to have, but also she was the equivalent of the Secretary of State, which is extraordinary, and extraordinary for women. And since I'm in a world of women myself, I won't go into all that, but I have 4 daughters, and all right at Caltech, across the street where I live, and all that, and my wife, and a full-time career. And the message that she set out about women and women as leaders is one that I think we need to bring home everywhere, and particularly in India. So let me stop with that, and I'll get back finally into a little about what we're doing. But let's talk about energy efficiency. And I think Peter set it out absolutely correctly. And I had the good fortune, just when I stepped down from NRDC, and my wife and I just married, and my wife and I had moved to live in Portland, Oregon, where I'd grown up. And that was our plan, but it didn't last for very long, because out of the blue, Jerry Brown, who I admire greatly, not too widely greatly admired by many people, but he asked me to head the Water Resources Board for the state of California. And that absolutely applies to environment and energy efficiency and global warming, because California, as you know, is a state that is so utterly dependent on water supplies in the southern portion of the state. And so I had the good fortune to deal with that under conditions in which California had the 2 driest consecutive water years in its history. And so if you think about India and the dryness in India's northern regions and its eastern regions, if we don't find a way to deal with climate change, India is in the worst position of any of the major countries in the world. Now, we in the U.S. have some of that, China has some of that, but India stands alone, along with the very small countries like Taiwan, who with a slight rise in the water levels is just in a terrible position. So there was that, and then when I went on from NRDC, and Jerry Brown asked me to do the water and then the regulation of utilities and lots of things in the state, we were able to make a very small change in the way traditional utility regulation had been done, and that is we made it, I think, the obvious, but it's still, and Ralph Cavanagh, one of the great leaders in my judgment of NRDC over all these years, worked with me a lot on that, and we simply changed regulations such that utilities were not incentivized, as is traditional still across nearly the entire United States and around the world. They made money by building power plants and transmission lines and distribution lines. And we simply changed it slightly to say, no, there's no incentive. We wouldn't provide any extra value for doing that, but we would provide extra value for energy efficiency. That is, finding ways to take these kinds of steps, and it's not easy. We brought in immediately 2,000 people to Edison. Ralph Cavanagh and NRDC people were on our grounds. We had a special area where Ralph, some of the time, and a whole series of scientists and others at NRDC brought that together. And so that's what I did over those years. And then when I went into the business, as I say, of initially kind of big surprise to me, but I became the CEO of Southern California Edison some years later, and then changed that to Edison International. So we did this all around the world, but it all steps along the way. Ralph, in particular, led us in the focus on how, if we privatized an electric system anywhere, as we did in Australia, we were the first to do that. We were in a number of places around the world. The heart of it in nearly all cases was not to look to build new power plants, but to get the most out of the power plants we had through energy efficiency steps. So with that, I will close and just say how much I value the opportunity to be here, and I'm honored to be recognized again for the founding of NRDC, but it's all of you here that are making the real difference around the world. And we have, in some important ways, it's not that we're not, that I'm not very proud of that, but I think we have to move beyond to engage the great scientists of the world. So I live right by Caltech. I work a lot with leaders at Caltech who are working on the kind of total breakthrough through physics, through chemistry, to capture sunlight such that sunlight is readily available just a little bit more all the time around the world. And the energy efficiency steps that we took in California are a relative drop in the bucket compared with what has to be done by way of making a dramatic change, not incremental small changes in energy efficiency, as important as those certainly are. So our plan here that we're working on is working with these key people. It happens that I know the ones at Caltech, where they're just unimaginably powerful work being done by brilliant people. And that's true, by the way, at other places around the world, Tsinghua in China. Terra and all the things Terra has really has these attributes of brilliant people, for example, creating the great universities now that have been created by Lena, who I came to know when I was asked to do the global climate change for the Secretary General's, United Nations Secretary General's advisory work. And then we need, frankly, the people that are willing to take a big bet on the possibility. And I think the probability that over the next 10 years, we will have a breakthrough on the part of these extraordinary scientists, and we can make a difference around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Susan.
Yeah. So thank you so much, John, and thank you again, all of you, for coming. We're now getting to the part of the program where we're going to have it be a roundtable discussion. We're thrilled to see so many people here. Because the time has been cut short a bit, we've got about 45 minutes, and what we wanted to do is we've sort of teed up each of the three main topics under energy efficiency that we wanted to touch on. So government policies, looking at business and technology, and looking at US-India bilateral cooperation. We're going to have a moderator for each of those sections who sort of tees up some of the main questions to address. And then also does a brief conclusion at the end of the discussion. But these are meant to be times for all of us to participate. So we really then look forward to sort of short comments from as many people as possible during each of those sessions. We can take about 15 minutes for each topic, so it's quite short, but rather than having speeches or presentations, it will just be a good discussion, I think. And then we'll try to wrap up the whole thing at the end and conclude. So Radhika, did you want to sort of tee up the different sections that we've got coming?
Sure. So as all of you should have in front of you, we have three themes that we want to explore with regards to energy efficiency, government policies, business and technology, and US-India bilateral cooperation on those issues. And for each of those three groups, like Susan was saying, we have moderators who will lay forth the questions, and then we look forward to hearing from each of you about your insights on those themes. So I'm going to turn it over to Graham, who will talk about the government policies piece. Graham Pugh leads the U.S. Department of Energy office focused on clean energy and climate change, and that includes serving as a secretariat for the 23 government clean energy ministerial, as well as planning and implementing many of the initiatives that DOE works on. So Graham, over to you.
If it's okay, so I can see everybody, I think I'll stand and walk around a bit. So thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to moderate this session. Just a quick bit of framing and amplification. In the clean energy ministerial process, in particular on the efficiency initiatives, we have a very strong bilateral relationship with India, in particular working with the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. And that covers equipment and appliance efficiency, it covers buildings, it covers industrial efficiency. And it's been quite a productive partnership. But there's a lot of work to be done. Let me just throw out a statistic to frame this. The projection that was done in a recent LBNL study that Peter quoted, which is that if you go out to 2030, we'll go from 3 million to 300 million air conditioners in India. If you take that growth in air conditioning globally, the projected demand, if you look at the current minimum efficiency standards for air conditioners, by 2030 will swamp the incremental renewables capacity additions in the globe, right? So we think about the visibility of all those wind farms and all those solar panels, and it looks great and we feel good. But if we don't do the practical steps of implementing minimum efficiency standards, likewise efficiency in buildings and in industry, we'll just swamp all those gains. So we have a lot of work. One last bit of framing, and then we'll go to the questions. One of the things I find most interesting in working with governments around the world is you can see how they manage these issues. And what I see with India is a great deal of similarity between the U.S. and India in the fact that the states are such key actors. So we have some activities that are centralized in the national government. So minimum standards, for example, cover the entire nation in both India and the United States. But when it comes to buildings, we all know that's highly disaggregated. And we also know that there are a number of barriers to implementing building efficiency. We know that India has model building codes, but they need to be implemented by the states. And we know that the business case needs to be critically important, and NRDC has helped to illustrate the business case in their study. So with that bit of framing, the distributed nature and the incredible potential that it could arise from efficiency measures and the role that, for this part of the discussion, the role that government plays, would anybody like to highlight what they think are sort of key examples of progress that can be made through the role of government, either at the national level or state or local level?
Does it have to be stated in the positive?
I think, we learn from our mistakes, so I think it's fine to highlight things that haven't worked out.
Okay, I didn't mean to be quite so trite, but I think we focus. My name is John Poland, and I'm with Philips Electronics, and I think we tend to focus a lot on tangential policies as opposed to really the core of what you said earlier, which is energy efficiency, measurable results. So I'll pick on a couple of examples in that respect. Certainly, U.S. tax policy tries to pick winners and losers and drives behaviors as opposed to driving just maybe the result of energy efficiency. Maybe that should be the behavior, obviously, not one product over the other. And I would say In the private sector, we have the same problem, an example being LEED certification. Excellent program, very valuable, but does not necessarily produce the energy efficiency results we want. So I just would say that I think we need to be more focused on energy efficiency results and not sometimes the tangential outcomes that are created.
So let me just get some more clarity in your comment, and then we'll move to another one. So, of course, one of the challenges when you talk about results is you've got baselines. You've got to have a methodology. It's got to be a methodology that's agreed upon by everyone, especially if you're going to link it to tax consequences, for example, or some kind of policy measures. So, how do you think we go about doing that?
We'll go back to what was said earlier. You have to set a baseline. You have to have a measurement. Otherwise, people will work the system, game the system. So I think that first and foremost, whether you're an individual building owner or a government trying to drive a policy, you need to set a process where current use is measured so that any type of behavior that you're trying to drive toward greater efficiency can also be measured and verified. So I mean, our company is not in the M&V business, but we don't want to guarantee anything that can't be measured and verified, nor does anyone else. And that's where we get results in energy efficiency, is when you have measurable, verifiable outcomes.
You mean a lot of M&V companies really happy with your statements, which get them right on the case with federal policies. Go ahead.
So I'm Bill Sisson with United Technologies. Sort of building on this conversation, I think Peter mentioned some of the programs being headed up in New York, and so from a policy perspective, it's great to see cities in the United States setting up and mandating energy disclosure. This is starting to break through this information barrier that I think we all recognize is in the market, and I believe this is also being accomplished in India in programs like GRIA and other rating and labeling activities. Still some room for improvement, but I think it's a start. And what I think is important about the disclosure programs in the U.S. that I think is critical is something you just brought up, which is the standard under which disclosure is occurring. And it's not a perfect system, but I think all of the cities, and there's 7 or 8 of them now, New York being one, I think Philadelphia recently, are all using the EPA and DOE Energy Star portfolio manager as a basis for reporting energy. And I think that's an underlying and often missed important point, that there is a de facto standard now being applied to how that data is being assembled. So I just thought I'd bring that up.
That's very interesting, and sounds like a potential best practice approach that people could rally around and replicate. Are there any other views on that, or any other examples that somebody would like to bring up?
Yeah, I am Varshney from PTC India Limited, India. Government of India has taken a lot of initiative in energy, but primarily it has been observed that it is more like an academic interest than the practical. It has not been converted into a business model. We took initially, as per the Directive of Ministry of Power, government, we tried to take up 6 projects. One was the President Estate, the center of seat of democracy, that building, and then we started with other government agencies to start working on ESCO model. Investment grade energy audits, prelim audits, everything worked out. But when you want to go to the ESCO model, then there were a lot of challenges. Challenges was the management side, they were very positive that it should be implemented. But the people down the line, they were not very much interested that it should be given on an ESCO model to other people. So that's where we got stuck up. In spite of the best of the efforts, the government is doing it around. It is not becoming a success model. So I just wish to know, are there any successful models which had really worked out under this particular concept? Honestly.
Can I just get a little more clarification from you of why you think the ESCO model has not taken off in India the way people have thought it might?
So primarily, it can be attributed to 3 reasons. One is the financiers. People are not very people are reluctant, and the bankers are also reluctant to finance these models, because the gestation period of their return on investment can be as low as about 2 years to as high as about 9 to 10 years. And primarily, people don't have that particular patience to go in for a business model where your return on investment is more than 3 years. This is one of the major aspects.
And do you think there's a role for government policy to address that? It sounds like it's a feature of the market. Is there a role for government?
No, that's right. Government, initially, they came around, it was not mandatory, it was optional. So that's why it was not taken very seriously. Now the government has come under certain models. 8 missions have been there, and one is National Mission of Energy Efficiency. Under that, a PAT model has been identified.
Right.
And now it is in various stages of implementation. So let's see how it works out, because it's quite recent.
So the PAT scheme is for certain industrial sectors, perform a chief trade for those who may not be familiar with it.
But
do you think there is the possibility of doing that sort of model in the commercial building space?
No, that's right. Under PAT scheme, they've identified 8 areas. One is cement sector is there. Different sectors have been identified. Power sector is also there. But primarily, the challenges which has started coming up, the feedback we are getting is, say a power sector which is there, say 100 megawatt unit, the way of analyzing that thing and say super thermal power station, analyzing is different. Cement factory, but if it's about producing about, say, X tons, and suppose it is producing X square tons, the baselines and other things are also shifting. So it's a big challenge how to fix up the baselines for these particular activities.
Yeah. Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on the role of Escos? Is there, some of you may be familiar with Escos as applied in different contexts, US or others around the world. Sure. There are probably others who could do it far better than I, but essentially an energy service company is one that goes in and assesses the opportunity to do a retrofit or energy improvements, and essentially enters into a contract to do that and pay themselves back with the proceeds of the energy savings over time with some interest on top of it. But it's essentially a long-term contract to address the upfront costs of the energy retrofit. And so that is something that's been, I think.
How do they measure that?
Well, that's key, right? So the measurement is absolutely key. One needs to have a baseline, and one needs to do it relative to that historical baseline. But you may have changes. You have to take into account changes if in an industrial context of production or in the use of a building.
Could you identify yourself? Oh, Maria Seidler with Dominion Resources. Mm-hmm. Our company had the utility, our regulated utility subsidiary, had an energy savings target they had to meet. Mm-hmm. And we talk about, you were talking about the brilliant scientists, but we had a particular team that started to look at this and trying to figure out where we could make savings. And since I'm listening to all of our talk about energy efficiency on the building, the industrial processes, and you talk about the link between renewable and efficiency, we found an area for efficiency that is, I think, being very much overlooked, that actually should be a required component of the building efficiency. And one of the reasons, because it does provide you measurement, and that is leveraging more of our AMI mm-hmm. and adding the more adaptability on the voltage side. We've developed and we look at saying we can help create 4 to 6% energy efficiency savings by managing the voltage that's on the primary circuits into the house. Mm-hmm. And that helps drive the efficiency measurement that's coming out of all of the appliances, all of those air conditioners you're talking about. If you don't look at the distribution side of the grid, you are leaving energy savings on the table.
Right. Let me stop you there and just say, so I think that falls into the key measurement category. You can't improve what you don't measure, and it's all a question of where you draw the boundary, right? So you can look at the boundary as the house, but you can also look at the distribution network.
Look on the other side, but that AMI is the interconnect.
Sure.
And there's a lot that could be done on the measurement side. In fact, the voltage program software that we have works with the AMI. You've got to, right now AMI is mostly for billing, but you can measure it can be set to measure voltage, and that will help you measure the efficiencies that are going on inside that house.
Right.
And you know, which goes to government that goes to government policy.
No,
right?
I understand. No, I think we need to move on. It's a little outside the scope, although your point is well taken.
And you say it's outside the scope, but that's part of the problem.
No,
It's
I'm not dismissing it.
in
I
any
just
scope.
think we want to. I just think we want to.
Right.
Just want to move on and get any other views that we might have on sort of the government policy role. Sorry.
My name's Don Reed. I'm with a company called Aston Field Renewables. We do solar development in India. But my question really relates to, I think, what you're talking about. In the United States, I've read that of the electricity that we waste today, we probably waste, and I've read this, but I'd be very curious to know if others in the room have a view, that we probably waste 50% of the energy that we produce in the United States. And of that waste, half would be associated with this notion of base versus peak, and we just generate electricity into the ground, we waste it. And that the balance is really the sum total of what we waste in buildings and what we waste in home environments, right? Or maybe it's 60-40 in favor of buildings versus residential. I was with the CEO of one of the largest property developers in the world last week, and he was telling me that the two big issues, and I don't know what the role is for government to play in this, that the two big impediments in the US, and this would contrast with India, which has yet to build their buildings in large measure, but in the United States, where we have this extant body of buildings, the two big impediments to creating efficiencies are, in existing structures, are this notion of a second lien, a mortgage associated with the capital improvements, and the first mortgage holders, in almost every single case, are unwilling to yield a preference to a second lien. That's a huge practical problem. Right. And the other issue is getting the tenant to pay. These buildings may be owned by Prudential, but the people who are paying for it, General Electric, IBM, the tenant. And the tenants heretofore have been completely unwilling to pay for the improvements associated with energy efficiency. They're happy at $15 a square foot. You want to charge them $17, they'll tell you to take a hike. So I don't know how government plays a role in that, but if we're talking openly about creating efficiency improvements, at least half of the gain that we can produce is associated with buildings.
Right. So just a comment on it. I think the energy disclosure piece, I mean, one role for governments could be to mandate disclosure of energy use at the time of sale. That helps when properties change hands. Of course, it doesn't help in the interim unless you implement some sort of policy. But the ability to capitalize the efficiency improvements on top of a mortgage and get kind of the long-term financing structure is one you may or may not know was actually that was attempted to be implemented at the beginning of the Obama administration. It ran into challenges because of the recovery from the housing crisis. I think we haven't seen the last of that. It's a very interesting policy piece, and you highlight a big challenge. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to next questions, and maybe we'll have a chance to come back later at the end of the session.
No? Next question or the next session?
So, and we'll have a chance to return to some of the questions and comments that you may still have. I do want to bring in another piece of the dimensions of energy efficiency that move beyond government policies, but look really at business and technology, which is really the second group that can move the market. And we see that both in the US and in India, and the leading role that a lot of the companies with leaders like yourselves can play. And I do want to turn it over to Prashant Kapoor to moderate and ask the group some of the questions for the next 15 minutes. And to give a bit of background, Prashant guides the IFC's global green building investments in developing countries, and he focuses on financing low-carbon developments, sustainable building materials, ESCOs, and green mortgages. So again, this is a time for us to talk a little bit more about financing and ESCOs and the green mortgages piece as well. So Prashant, over to you.
Hi there. I think, having living in the US and doing a lot of work in India, I can see that there are a lot of things that are so similar, in terms of both markets being very market-driven. The sort of private sector is quite a strong player in this. Unlike, say, Europe or even China, for example, they would be a little bit more similar, whereas US and India would be in one sort of space in a way. But it also has a very distinct difference. I mean, US is pretty much built. It's in a lot of ways, it's a very formal place where you can start to look at how you build energy efficiency in something existing. So you can measure and you can add. But also, you've got this focus, and India generally is fairly fickle. In terms of its energy consumption, people generally are conscious in the market. I mean, maybe that'll change over time, but today, because of, for them, energy is not just about cost, it's about power. They don't have power supply a lot of times. Even water, even places like Bombay probably only have 6 hours of water in a normal apartment block. This is the biggest, richest city in India, for example. So for them, they have a different relationship to energy, in a sense. So I just wanted to sort of bring that as a connection between the government side and to our side. And on the business and technology side, I think it'll be interesting to understand, what are the key points that have succeeded in the US that can be applied, given the context, in terms of technology. Do you think there's a gap in the technology space? That's one thing, that we don't see in India. And the second is, what are the barriers? What in the US as well as in India, I think they may be different, my guess is, in terms of energy efficiency promotion through technology. Is it knowledge that's the gap? Is it inability to take on extra costs? Is it financing that's the problem? Or is it incentives and regulations? I just wanted to open up that discussion that way.
I think it's all. But not to jump to an answer. Sorry, Henry Stangas with the U.S. Trade and Development Agency. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about business and technology and the solutions they have to provide, and it's something that our agency contributes funds towards, and supporting the business community bringing such solutions. But I think your question is very relevant because you touch on all the different influences that must be brought to bear. And I just wanted to flag some efforts that I think we're all a part of supporting. There's a industry group that we helped form, and there's some members here. UTC chairs a working group related to buildings, energy efficiency, and have tried to promote the adoption of solutions, especially, as many people point out, India, it has so much built environment yet to be built. And taking best practices, if you will, and technology and business models to states viewed to be leading in their interest in adopting these strategies, and wanted to ask some of the companies who are participating in that effort their view on adoption prospects in India.
Thank you. Please.
Bill Sisson again with United Technologies. India is a very important market for us, and the adoption and growth potential there is, to coin a phrase from last night, mind-blowing. Right? You've heard a reference to air conditioning growth opportunities there. So, but it's also important to us as a location where we have to be responsible, and we have to do the right things, and we have to encourage a much greater penetration of energy consciousness, energy efficiency, and all the things we're talking about here. So those two things go hand in hand. To Prashad's question, technology is key, but the human side of technology is what matters. And I just put this in the context of the automobile. The car you drive today is smarter than your building in many ways. It knows when it's not healthy. It knows when to fine-tune some aspect of its performance so that it can get the gas mileage that it's supposed to get. It can tell you when you're unsafe. There's lots of aspects that the automobile industry has penetrated into in terms of smart automobiles that we're ways away from in the building sector. Part of it's market demand. Some of it may be enabled by disclosure. I have hope for that. But I do believe there's a human aspect to this conversation, which is technology depends on the human to enable it. And I think one of the lessons we're learning here in the US that I think is bilateral is if technology isn't installed correctly, you don't get what you think you're getting. And I think this is a much different subject than perhaps a technology conversation, but it's about education, it's about skills, it's about workforce training, it's about enabling that greater, smarter building with a conscious set of market actors that don't exist yet.
Thank you. I just want to sort of, maybe India is so complex in some ways in terms of, there are people who live in the first world and then the people who live in the third and then there are people in the middle as well. So you kind of have to find the right method to reach the various parts of it. So there are people that use almost as much energy, and the buildings reflect that too, in terms of air conditioning and the amount of glass they would use. And there I can see that fit, in terms of smart buildings and all of that. But there are people that don't have the basic needs, and I think they would aspire, and that's where I think the idea of and having just worked in across the border in Mexico, you could see that air conditioners go across the old ones. They probably have almost barely enough Freon, and they buy it at almost no cost, and they use it in Tijuana and places. So it's that level there, and there are sort of issues at that level which only government policy probably can tackle. Technology is a way, maybe there are smarter systems that can reach them too. Would be interesting to get your thoughts as to whether there needs to be different ways to tackle the various markets.
Okay, let me make a couple of comments. I'm from India. Name is Valluri. I'm from Ingersoll Rand. I run Ingersoll Rand for the India region. So I'm actually going to combine a couple of responses on government policy and something on business and technology. I don't know how many of you are aware that India has made substantial improvements in terms of government policies for energy efficient appliances. So if you look at Mathur and BE, et cetera, I think they are pretty far ahead in the game in terms of actually applying star ratings on appliances. So that's just one piece of the equation of what kind of appliances or energy efficient products you would use at residential homes or even manufactured products. The other piece is really of energy consumption. How do you actually define standards of energy consumption across industries, across verticals? What should be a retail enterprise? What should be the benchmark for a retail enterprise? What should be the benchmark for a pharma sector? What should be the benchmark? Somebody talked about a cement industry. What should be those benchmarks? And I think data analytics over there becomes extremely important for the country to enable government to define policies. And I think today organizations like Ingersoll Rand, IBM, et cetera, are really working on a fundamental shift of ensuring how do you actually capture data in a number of industries. So we're actually working on that. Let me take an example on what you're talking about, this whole chain between large buildings to middle segment to bottom of the pyramid of how we're actually capturing energy efficiency in these areas. We recently did an example with NRDC of looking at a building in Bombay with Godrej. Godrej is a large industrial house in India. And as we kind of improved their HVAC systems, which obviously constitute about 60% of the energy consumption in a building, we realized that they could actually deliver probably 10 to 15% energy reduction year on year by putting more efficient HVAC systems. But the issue is really, if those of you who've been in India, you'll realize that you don't have too much of grid power. Most of the buildings run on captive DG sets. So if you really look at buildings, you have a captive diesel generating sets, which probably provides 100% power backup. So you've got grid power, you've got diesel generating sets. So how do you actually define a building is energy efficient or not? So there is a different kind of a challenge in emerging economies of saying, how do you actually innovate technology solutions for those markets where you've got different sets of energy consumption? So it becomes very, very difficult or extremely difficult to define what those standards need to be. So in one of the case studies or one of the examples, what we did is, if you really look at the mobile industry market in India, which is really the telecom market in India, and you are aware of the example of India going from a penetration of, literally 5 to 10% all the way up to now 80% of the population getting mobile telephones, you could see that the society as such accepts technology which are economically benefit for them. I mean, they actually create an economic change. And we do see that power or energy would exactly be the same if you're actually able to provide the low-cost power systems that the absorption will be pretty high. So what we did is we actually worked with IBM and we said, Mr. IBM, you're good at data analytics. We are good at a domain strategy or domain competence of HVAC systems. Why don't we do an innovation convergence? So Ingersoll Rand and IBM joined hands together where IBM could pick data off the buildings and Ingersoll Rand could actually take the data, analyze the data, go back to the building and say, the way to do energy efficiency is by actually providing interventions of ABC. So now here you see that the technology convergence becomes extremely important, that you don't end up reinventing technology everywhere, but whereas you start using complementary technologies and start actually creating solutions in emerging economies. Now I'm sure even in the US, if you were power deficit, if you were energy deficit, you would have had alternate solutions to fix that. Now if you're power surplus, your innovation would be probably restricted to a certain limit by saying that, okay, for this sector, for this segment, we would drive some energy efficiency for economic benefits. But in India, it's just not economic benefits, you also got to look at social benefits. So there are two things that go hand in hand. So, to your question, whether there's a technology chasm between an emerging economy like India and the US, I think both countries have unique problems and you've got to kind of create unique solutions. Is there a market for that? I think there's a tremendous market for that. Because now we believe that what we do there, we can actually reverse globalize it. We can take some of those technologies and actually put them across the world. So to your question, should the policy for government be influenced? Absolutely yes. But the government is no more knowledgeable than what the industry is. So they need help. So they need data to say what should be the benchmark on which we should base the policy. And for that, I think industry needs to come forward, provide the technology, get the data, provide them with that and say, maybe for the retail sector, this should be the benchmark. And now you build, that should be the bare minimum. Now you start building a policy. So I think it's a two-way street right now of how you want to kind of build that. Yeah, just want to add that. Yeah.
Thanks. Just on the benchmarking side, IFC World Bank is working at universal, because we feel that there is a gap, especially the asset side. Empirical data may be difficult, but at least at the asset rating, we're coming up with a global tool where at least people can benchmark for various strata, actually, because you don't want to have a global benchmark for India. As we know, there's different economic strata. So just one last question, actually. We haven't touched on materials because, India is being built today. So if you imagine 10% of cement, 10% of India's emissions comes from cement, okay? And 10% of India's emissions also comes from energy. So it's almost equal if you look at it, energy generation, electricity generation. So are there any thoughts? Because, brick manufacturing is huge in India. 300 billion bricks are being made every year, causing about 70 million tons of carbon, million tons of carbon emissions in India alone. So I think that's one unexplored opportunity in terms of technology. So any thoughts on that? Jigar?
I'm Jigar Shah, Institute for Industrial Productivity. There is an enormous potential for some of the technologies in India. And I think, as the last speaker from Ingersoll Rand rightly said, it's just about the right incentives. To give you a quick example, in the cement sector, there is a possibility to do a lot of waste heat recovery and generate power. The Indian cement technology lends itself, the kilns lend themselves very well for this transformation. This transformation is it's been very well demonstrated in China. There's over 500 such applications just in China alone. And similar technology and potential exists in doing this in India. The reason it doesn't happen in India is because a lot of the cement manufacturers in India, they have captive power plants. And to boost the power generation by 10 or 15 megawatts, they'd rather just burn more dirty coal than adopt a technology that's very effective for perceptions of risk and so on. So there are, in fact, these technologies that exist that can really transform many parts of different manufacturing. But, I think it has to be played with the right incentives, the right government policies, and so on.
Great. I think I'll let Susan take over now. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. And like I said, we'll have a chance to come back and assimilate our thoughts from that very interesting discussion. The last theme that we have is very relevant in the context that we're meeting today, which is the US-India Energy Summit. And it is on US-India bilateral cooperation, particularly for energy efficiency, and how we can sort of take that to the next level. As many of you are familiar, there are already clean energy is an area where there is a lot of good dialogue between the two countries. But it would be good to hear more about how we can encourage that collaboration further. And I am going to turn it over to John Fennerty to lead that discussion. John is the director of the Office of India Affairs in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs at the State Department. And prior to that, he was the economic counselor at the US Embassy in Buenos Aires, in Delhi, and also in Dublin. So John, for you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. I really want to thank NRDC for convening this conversation today, because for us who work in Indian Affairs of State, this is absolutely perfect timing. We have our, with India, we have 30 dialogues now covering a range of every spectrum of bilateral issues. But next month, at the end of next month, and I can't give you the date yet because it's not been officially announced, but the end of next month we have our overarching dialogue, the strategic dialogue that Secretary Kerry will be leading out to New Delhi. And he'll be bringing with him a number of very senior people from across the interagency in our government. And I can tell you this, that at the very top of the agenda will be energy/climate change. For our secretary, clean energy, climate change is a very, as I think most of you in this room know, it's a very passionate issue for him. And we're being tasked now over the next 6 weeks to come up with some really good ideas in the energy sector for bilateral cooperation. So I'm really counting on this group today to give us some really good ideas that we can tee up for the dialogue. Let me just give you a little bit of a chapeau on the current bilateral cooperation in energy, then I'll open it up. I have two specific questions I want to ask, but just to give you a sense, and as Graham knows fully well, probably maybe our most robust dialogue with India right now is actually our energy dialogue. I was in Delhi from 2005 to 2009 when Secretary Bodman chaired the Energy Department. I can tell you, with the 5 sub-working groups we have, including the working group on power generation and energy efficiency, we have this incredible, not just government-to-government activities going on with India, but what struck me from the last time that we had the energy dialogue at the Department of Energy in September of last year, chaired by Secretary Chu, was the incredible collaboration, direct collaboration between scientists and government officials across the range, the spectrum of energy cooperation. So, you know, the bilateral cooperation is actually very robust and ongoing. And when we had, and then after I left Delhi, the other seminal development was the launching in 2009 of the Partnership for the Advancement of Clean Energy, PACE, which since then, with the PACE as our acting secretary, Dan Poneman, mentioned today, we have the research component headed by DOE, and then we have the development component launched by our U.S. Agency for International Development. And then if you look down the list of accomplishments of the overall dialogue, we now have, as Acting Secretary Poneman mentioned, the R&D Center, the $125 million R&D Center, one of whose 3 components is looking at energy efficiency. And then we have this very nascent, incipient, ongoing now cooperation at the state and city level. We've, particularly a number of states in southern India, where we are looking very hard at, for example, green building initiatives and the smart grid initiatives with the central government. So it's, I guess what I'm trying to say to the group, it's not that we don't lack for, you know, very robust cooperation bilaterally, government to government, but I guess my 2 questions to the group today is, first of all, what are we doing right in that bilateral cooperation? What are we doing wrong in that bilateral cooperation? And how can we better focus our efforts? And what do we do next, one, on specifically on energy efficiency? What do we have to do next in terms of focusing on energy efficiency? And I'm talking again about bilateral cooperation. And also, how do we take the overall energy relationship we have with India now, engagement we have, and how do we take it to another level, a higher level than it is now? And this is something we're doing across the spectrum. We're looking at very closely going into the strategic dialogue at the end of next month. How do we take this to a higher level? And what do we do now to really focus on energy efficiency in terms of government to government?
Could I go over here?
Thank you. We'll go back. I'm Mark Ginsberg. I had the honor of serving at the Department of Energy for 20 years, the last 6 of which helped develop some of the dialogue that we're talking about, the U.S.-India energy dialogue, and part of the strategic dialogue that Secretary Clinton called the crown jewel of the relationship between our 2 countries, and then the early days of the PACE, the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy. One of the things I think we miss, and I think those things have gone well and have great potential to scale up. Now a year and a half out of DOE, I've been able to look with perspective at one of the things I think we miss is the opportunity to work with other ministries. We're kind of stovepiped, kind of naturally working with Ministry of Power and Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, but the reality is that the Ministry of Urban Development has responsibility over the Mission for Sustainable Habitat. The Ministry of Commerce and Industry has responsibility over SEZs and other major development, as well as the economic development piece of energy that they have a great interest in. And so what I think could be very valuable is expanding the partnership to the ministries that have those direct relationships, particularly with the idea of scaling. I see the greatest opportunity in cities. And you look at the Mumbai-Delhi corridor, where you've got 10 potential mega cities that'll be developed. You have a chance to do it right. And it's easier to do it the first time than the next time, than the existing. Satellite cities and SEZs offer the same kind of opportunity. Those are just some thoughts.
Let me follow up on that, throw this out. One of the challenges on that, I absolutely agree with you, is just in India alone, one of the problems we have is why the energy dialogue was placed under the leadership of Montek Singh Ahluwalia is because you have so many Indian ministries involved, and we have one DOE, they have many doing different things. So they put it under the Planning Commission. Now, if we bring in, we want to engage with other Indian ministries, which I think you're right, we need to do. That adds ministries to we need to engage with, but also it means then we have to, on our end, bring in other U.S. government agencies. Do you have any ideas how do we do that more efficiently, or how would we better focus those efforts in that kind of engagement? Because we're talking about a very wide bandwidth is the issue.
The good news is that there are already interagency agreements within the government of India on things like the Energy Conservation Building Code. Ministry of Urban Development has responsibility for the city development plans that have to now include that. So I think there's an existing mechanism, and Mr. Ahluwalia, I believe, understands those relationships in my conversations with him. And so I don't think you have to create completely new relationships, but convening working groups among the existing ministries, I think can overcome that. And they're already working with some of that. When I talk with Ajay Mathur, he would say, yes, I'm working with Ministry of Urban Development. And when I talked with the Joint Secretary at Ministry of Urban Development, they said the same. So it is a challenge, and it is something that we had difficulty with at DOE of bandwidth and capability of expanding our work. But I think you can find a way to do that. And again, focusing on the energy side of development in new cities, you've got some capability of keeping it a little more focused.
Great, thanks.